Back to fraud now and the Action Fraud story. And the guy that infiltrated Action Fraud in London, got a job there, is called Paul Morgan Bentley, bless him, from the Times newspaper.
The reason we went undercover at first at Action Fraud is we just kept seeing articles in other papers, in our own paper, from victims who were saying that they'd reported their very serious cases to Action Fraud and then they'd been abandoned with no explanation. We also saw some comments from former employees online talking about how the service was being mismanaged. So I applied for a job there, got the job. What we found was that there was a culture of mocking victims, of misleading victims, suggesting that their cases would be investigated when they knew they wouldn't. The managers there were mocking victims as morons, joking about them. A lot of the victims that call Action Fraud are very vulnerable. They would refer to them as psychos, as screwballs. And obviously that really shocked me because you go into a call centre that's supposed to be helping victims of crime, and this is the language that scammers use. If this was just a couple of junior members of staff, the people making these comments were the managers. So, for instance, if you go onto the Times, you'll see our full footage. Most of the footage is of the trainer who is he's hired by Concentrix, the outsourced provider, to train every new employee that comes into work in the call centre. These are senior members of staff at Action Fraud.
And the person in charge of Action Fraud is not actually working, of course, at Action Fraud because it's all been outsourced to this company called Concentrica, a US company. And that is Commander Karen Baxter of the City of London Police. She spoke to John Humphreys on the Today programme.
Let me apologise to victims and the public for having witnessed this footage. I'm angry about it and it is entirely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in any way. As soon as I was informed of this footage and of this information from Paul, I have very robustly had a number of meetings with Concentrix, our service providers. They have commenced urgently an investigation, and currently there are a number of staff subject to that investigation and there are a number of staff suspended. I think that is entirely appropriate.
Wouldn't it have been more appropriate to sack Concentrix?
I think the first thing is that there is a degree of due diligence to be applied in this, but what I would like to reassure you is that when I look at this contract, when I look at the work, when I look at the standards going forward, all of those things will be scrutinised. I agree with Paul. When victims of fraud and economic crime phone Action Fraud, I expect them to be dealt with empathetically and that they are supported. Now, I think this is not endemic, and I would disagree with Paul that, I know that Paul was there, I think you were there, Paul, for 6 days. I am told and I'm assured this morning that it is not endemic. However, he is right that there is one member of staff who's in a managerial role. That is not acceptable and it will not be tolerated.
And he'll be fired.
I can't say that at the moment because that is a matter for Concentrix, the service provider. But what I can say is that behaviour has no place in Action Fraud. It falls well below the standards of policing and well below the standards of the City of London.
But the reason I say he'll be fired, if he is not fired, I assume it's a he, by the way, it is, then Concentrix shouldn't be carrying out this job, should
I
they?
can assure you, John, and I'm conscious that we cannot talk about individual cases.
No, we've not named
that
him.
behaviour and individuals who show that behaviour in Action Fraud and in that call centre, particularly in a managerial role, have no place in Action Fraud as we see it today. So I will be doing a really stringent review around the standards. The one thing I would say is that actually Paul has done something for us that I perhaps could not have done in ways with the resources and the delivery of the service.
Going to be my question, why didn't the police find out themselves what was going on?
So we are always aware that it's like being on a good day at school. So what Paul has done this morning and over the last few months is that in going in there undercover, it has provided what is effectively the secret shopper. So for that, I will take that information. We will scrutinise that and we will look at improving standards for the future.
But it goes beyond that, doesn't it? Professor David Cantor, one of the country's foremost criminal psychologists, he found Action Fraud to be completely useless. He'd had £18,000 stolen by scammers. While he was trying to reclaim the money, he discovered the UK bank account details of the fraudsters, tried to report them to Action Fraud. He was told by them they didn't want the information. His case would not be passed on to police. So there's something rotten at the core of this, isn't there?
So what I would say, John, is I'm not going to discuss individual cases. What we have in terms of fraud is that we have over 900,000 contacts in regard to fraud coming to Action Fraud every single year. just under 300,000 of those end up being crimes. This is one of the fastest growing crime types that is affecting the United Kingdom. And what we need to do, not just in policing, not just in action fraud, but right across society, is decide, how do we take this forward? We conduct an enormous amount of business with partners, with the National Economic Crime Centre, with business and banking. And what that is about trying to prevent it happening in the first place. We prevented £94 million of fraud last year with one of our units at the City of London. And I think that's where we need to get to. But it is unacceptable, and I will not tolerate it going forward.
Commander Baxter and Paul Morgan-Bentley, thank you both very much in that story in The Times.
Yeah, so she's then going on to say, I agree with him, but I'm not actually doing anything. Quite shocking. I'll put a full version of that interview up on our podcast at thisweek.org.uk. But actually, when she's apologising, this commander from the police there, she's saying, I apologise for this footage. She's not actually saying, I apologise for people who will have seen this footage. I'm apologising. She's not actually apologising for what she's doing. Anyway, this does seem to be something to do with outsourcing here, Joss. And the City Council, we do quite a lot.
We do an awful lot of outsourcing these days, yeah. About monitoring and evaluating and making sure that due diligence is done before you take you actually give the contract to somebody should be done. And if they're not doing the job properly and they're not being appropriate with their users, then actually they need to be held to account.
I mean, as a victim of fraud, as many people are, of course, and there's these phone scams, there's email scams and all sorts, you would hope that someone's going to take you seriously. But what we're hearing there is, oh no, these people are just psychos and morons, and this is and screwballs. And this is the sort of language that you'd expect from a fraudster, not from the police.
It's disgusting. It's just disgusting.
Martin, Concentrica are not apparently have been asked by the City of London Police to investigate themselves over this.
Well, I mean, Centrica, another company, also contracts a lot to local authorities. The whole idea of local authorities subcontracting and the police subcontracting out fraud investigations to private investigators, it just, it's in a previous generation that would have been regarded as absurd. And that's where we're at.
So I spoke earlier this morning, actually, to an old friend of this programme, former fraud squad officer from the Met, Rowan Bosworth-Davis. He's also the author of a book called Fraud in the City, Too Good to Be True. And he wrote that in 1988. But he also said that after the Blue Arrow trial in 1992 and 1993, when some very powerful blue blood bankers got off, and it was a case that he was partly involved in, the message went out across the fraud squad in central London that there will be no more prosecutions of these very powerful bankers. So this is what Rowan Bosworth-Davis had to say about this case to me earlier today.
Here you have an agency that was set up at a time when there was great public concern about fraud and fraud management. And what the architects of this thing did was to forget that they forgot the underlying nature of fraud, which is that somebody is deceived. And the whole basis of that word means that someone's mind has been altered by a lie or some form of untruth. So when people are deceived, the people on these phones just laughing at them and saying, "Oh, what a fool you are," and calling them idiots and all the rest of it. But that is the very essence of the fraudster's skill, is that he actually deceives people so that they act upon his lies. So rather than sneering at people, fraud victims are, in many, many respects, to be pitied. Therefore, if that is the case, and if the government's got ambitions to allow people to be responsible for their own investments and be responsible for their own future financial well-being, in my book, and always was, they have a duty to ensure that where wrongdoing is carried out, there is a means of investigation and redress. And when you live in a world as we do now, where there are so many different methods of obtaining access to you and my personal information and personal data, it seems to me that the requirement to help to control wrongdoing is greater. And this has clearly failed. I mean, I remember with bitterness, real bitterness, all the sneers that were cast against the actions and the conduct of fraud squads in this country. And as an ex-fraud squad officer, I would feel very strongly about it. But the fact of the matter was, no sooner did they set up this vast edifice to deal with these fraud investigations, then before you knew where you were, they were outsourcing the very front-line agency that exists to sit between the criminal and the legal process. And it's outsourced to, the most lowly paid people earning most of minimum wage. What do they expect them to do? They suddenly expect them to all to become Sherlock Holmes and to actually do the job properly, or are they just going to sit on the end of the phone, do their 8 hours and go home?
Sometimes when people lose money, the organisation itself will say, well, sorry, that's just tough luck. And others will say, well, this is fraud.
Yeah,
because
that's why on the telephones you need people who understand the problem, who know how to tell the difference between what is fraudulent activity and what is just bad luck or bad judgment. My reading of this story is that the people they were employing to do this work were getting minimalist training, and in fact, when they had to take a test as part of their qualification process, the answers were written on the wall. So, if you haven't got people who know the difference between and you can take it from me that sometimes the distinction between fraud and bad luck is cigarette paper thin. You have to have a really good understanding of what is potentially fraudulent and what is not fraudulent to be able to make the judgment call as to whether or not to investigate or to, unfortunately, put the thing to bed. But more importantly, and this is the other thing that infuriates me about this action fraud thing, is that every single one of these allegations that's come in and has just been recorded and then obviously clearly then just shredded or, put in some dark, deep hole somewhere, never to see the light of day again, what those people are missing is that any criminal investigation, particularly criminal investigation that deals with allegations of crime that have patterns and have serials of activity, you actually need the details of all those allegations, even where you don't necessarily find sufficient evidence to be able to prosecute. You still need the details of that conduct, because you will find that once you start to analyse the behaviour, you'll start to see patterns emerging. And it's when you start seeing those patterns emerging that you can actually, because this is an intelligence gathering exercise, and when you see those patterns emerging, you can then talk to your investigators and say, look, we're looking at a new methodology appearing here. Because the criminals are always one jump ahead. They're always coming up with new scams and schemes and methods to defraud the public. I mean, look at the fraudulent practice that's been going on with private pension schemes and privately administered pensions. And I'll tell you another one that's out there, and it's a scam in waiting, and that's all this equity release. Old people being encouraged to engage in equity release schemes. Every single day, there are adverts appearing on Facebook to engage in equity release. And that's another rip-off in waiting, in my opinion. The criminals do these things because it's easy to get away with. But one of the things that I always cleave to, if you want to disincentivise criminals from engaging in certain kinds of conduct, what you have to do is you have to make it a very high degree of probability that they're going to get caught. The greatest disincentive to crime is the likelihood of being caught. And the only way we're going to do that in our society is to put systems and controls in place that make it very, very hard for these people to engage in this kind of behaviour and get away with it. The only problem there is that we're up against, as you are in all capitalist societies, you're up against there's a complete conflict of interest between the interests of the investor on the one hand, to invest in a safe environment, but at the same time to accept the risks of these products can go up as well as down and all those other things, as opposed to the interests of the banks and the financial institutions, whose interests are to get as much money out of your pocket as they possibly can in the shortest possible time. So there's always going to be a major conflict of interest. And I mean, I don't want to be seen to be pointing the finger at police and saying, you did a bad job, you did a good job, whatever. That's not my business. But what I am concerned about, I start from the premise that the moment you start outsourcing any form of regulatory administration and you outsource it to an agency that has to make money out of its contract, you are going to end up on the line of least resistance. Doesn't matter what it is, you're going to end up on the line of least resistance. So they will always employ people who, well, frankly, people who can't get jobs elsewhere. It's a dreadful indictment of the process. Once you start outsourcing these important regulatory controls to agencies that have no skin in the game, have no interest in ensuring that there's any kind of successful outcome, you're hiding to nothing.
That's Rowan Bosworth-Davies, former Fraud Squad officer there, and he's the author of a book, Fraud in the City, Too Good to Be True. Martin, it does seem that the fraud now is something that's actually being facilitated by Action Fraud, potentially, as they simply do not investigate things. That actually helps quite a lot of people, doesn't it? Fraudsters.
If you think back to the crisis in 2008, a decision was taken that if they were going to prosecute anybody, they'd have to prosecute everybody, and they weren't going to prosecute everybody, so they didn't prosecute anybody. And in actual fact, a lot of the top people of the top banks should have been sent to prison, and their assets.
So what you're saying, actually,
seized.
the biggest fraud of the lot happened in 2008.
Well, what happened at that point is fraud becomes, if you allow fraud, people who have got a bottom line every quarter to their bosses, they've got to engage in fraud as well. If other people are doing it, you've got to do it. And if you don't stop it, it becomes endemic. And it is endemic. The banks are insolvent and run by fraudsters.
Sounds like a bit of a virus, Joss. I know it's a bit of a deep one, this, but what Rowan's saying there is potentially the next load of fraud will be coming as people do this equity release scheme, and this is really a bonanza for the fraudsters, and it doesn't sound like Action Fraud are quite up to the job.
I have real reservations about equity release. It's a really expensive way of borrowing money, and it means that families are not going to have any equity in the property when it's actually finally sold. And I just think it's a real shame because the setup costs are really high.